My name is Audrey Vance, and at 31 years old, I am a senior structural engineer who spends my days calculating the precise load-bearing capacities of steel and concrete for the skyscrapers that define the Seattle skyline. I live in a world of rigid mathematics, where a single misplaced decimal point can cause a multi-million-dollar structure to collapse, yet nothing in my professional training could have prepared me for the structural failure of my own family. It was a drizzly Tuesday afternoon in late October when I walked into my parents' study in their $3.8 million estate in the exclusive Broadmoor neighborhood of Seattle, only to find my father, Harrison Vance, sitting behind his mahogany desk with the cold, detached air of a man presiding over a corporate merger. He did not look up immediately, instead focusing his attention on adjusting the midnight blue alligator strap of his $12,000 Patek Philippe Calatrava, a timepiece that cost more than the annual property taxes on the very house we were standing in. When he finally did acknowledge me, it wasn't with a greeting, but with a statement that felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus, delivered with the casual indifference one might use to comment on the weather. "Your little project can wait, but your brother's luxury watch collection is an investment for this family, so I liquidated your savings account," he stated, his voice as smooth and polished as the marble floors in the foyer. He didn't even blink as he slid a printed transfer receipt across the desk, a thermal paper death warrant showing a completed transaction for exactly $134,250.75. I stood there, the dampness of my charcoal gray Burberry trench coat seeping into my shoulders, staring at the numbers that represented every late night I had spent at the firm, every weekend I had sacrificed to oversee the seismic retrofitting of the downtown towers, and every penny I had clawed away for my own future. That money was not a rainy day fund or a simple savings account. It was the capital for my independent consulting firm, the project he had just dismissed with a wave of his manicured hand. My brother Julian, who at 28 had never held a job for longer than a fiscal quarter, was apparently in need of more assets to fill his custom-built carbon fiber watch windows, and my father had decided that my sweat and labor were the appropriate currency to fund Julian's vanity. The room smelled of expensive sandalwood incense and the lingering aroma of my father's afternoon espresso, a scent that now made my stomach churn with a violent, icy nausea. I looked at the receipt again, noting the timestamp of 11:14 a.m., the exact moment my father had used his power as a joint signatory on that account, a relic of my college years that I had foolishly never revoked to erase 5 years of my life. I am getting ahead of myself, but you need to understand the architecture of the Vance family to understand why this moment was the final stress test that broke the foundation. My father, Harrison, is a man who believes that the world is divided into two categories, those who command and those who serve the legacy. As a high-level real estate developer, he has built a life on the optics of success, maintaining an estate with a monthly mortgage and maintenance cost exceeding $22,000, staffed by a rotating crew of landscapers and housekeepers who keep the manicured lawns of the Broadmoor property looking like a postcard. My mother, Eleanor, is his silent partner in this charade, a woman who spends $4,000 a month on skincare and high-end Pilates classes at a boutique studio in Bellevue to maintain the appearance of effortless grace. Then there is Julian, the golden child, the one who was given a black 2024 Porsche 911 Carrera for his 27th birthday while I was still driving the same silver 2018 Honda CR-V I had bought used when I started my junior engineer position. Julian was the investment, the carrier of the name, while I was simply the reliable support beam expected to hold up the ceiling without ever being noticed. The $134,000 he stole from me wasn't just a number. It was the calculated sum of my independence. I had planned to use that money to launch Vance Structural Consulting, having already scouted a modest office space in the Pioneer Square district for $3,200 a month, and having drafted a business plan that projected a 6-figure revenue within the first year. My father knew this, but in his mind, my ambition was a threat to the hierarchy he had established. He preferred me tucked away in a mid-sized firm, earning a predictable salary that he could dip into whenever Julian's lifestyle exceeded his allowance. As I stood in that study, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a countdown. My father's Patek Philippe caught the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glint of gold and sapphire that mocked my years of frugality. He genuinely believed that because he had paid for my undergraduate degree at the University of Washington, he had a perpetual lien on my soul and my bank account. He viewed the $134,000 as a dividend he was owed, a redistribution of wealth from the worker to the heir. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry, because a structural engineer knows that when a system is under too much pressure, the most dangerous thing you can do is create a sudden vibration. I simply picked up the receipt, the paper feeling unnervingly light for something that carried the weight of my entire career. I looked at the Patek Philippe on his wrist, then at the rows of leather-bound books he never read, and finally at the man who had just dismantled my life with the click of a mouse. My father's arrogance was his blind spot. He assumed that I would continue to play the role of the dutiful, stoic daughter, that I would go back to my apartment in Queen Anne, cry into a glass of cheap wine, and show up at the next family dinner as if nothing had happened. He forgot that I am the person people call when they want to know exactly how much weight a structure can handle before it collapses into a pile of rubble. He forgot that I understand the legalities of property titles, the intricacies of high-interest bridge loans he had taken out to maintain this estate, and the fragile nature of the Vance family's credit rating. I walked out of that study without saying a word, my heels clicking sharply against the white oak herringbone floors. I passed the kitchen where my mother was discussing the menu for an upcoming charity gala with a caterer, a dinner that would likely cost $15,000, all of it billed to a line of credit that I knew was nearing its limit. I walked out to my Honda, the engine turning over with a reliable hum, a stark contrast to the volatile ego of the man I had just left behind. As I drove away from the Broadmoor gates, passing the perfectly trimmed hedges and the security kiosks, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The $134,000 was gone, transferred into a brokerage account to buy rare Swiss timepieces for a brother who couldn't tell the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition. But in liquidating my savings, my father had also liquidated his hold over me. He had broken the contract. He had removed the last pillar of loyalty that kept me from looking too closely at the cracks in his own fortress. By the time I reached my apartment, I wasn't thinking about the loss anymore. I was thinking about the $450,000 bridge loan my father had convinced me to co-sign 2 years ago when he was flipping a luxury condo project in South Lake Union. He had told me it was a formality, a way to help the family business while my credit score was pristine from years of responsible management. I realized then that my father hadn't just stolen my savings, he had been using my professional identity and my financial stability as the scaffolding for his entire crumbling empire. The $3.8 million house was a shell, a beautiful facade held up by debt, vanity, and my quiet compliance. He thought he was the architect of this family, but he was just a tenant in a house of cards. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began to pull up the digital files of every document I had ever signed for him. If he wanted to play with investments, if he wanted to treat my life like a commodity to be traded for Julian's baubles, then I would show him what happens when the engineer stops maintaining the structure. A building doesn't always fall down because of a storm. Sometimes it falls down because the person who knows its weakest point finally decides to let it. The foreclosure of the Vance estate didn't start with a bank notice. It started with that $12,000 Patek Philippe and a father who thought his daughter was too weak to fight back. But I am an engineer. I don't fight with emotions. I fight with physics, with law, and with the cold, hard reality of what happens when you remove the foundation of a home. Family is not a blood oath that gives you the right to pillage someone else's life. Family is a structure built on mutual respect and shared integrity, and when that integrity is gone, the only thing left to do is clear the site and start over from the ground up. To understand the depth of the betrayal my father committed, You have to understand the physical and mental toll of the life I have led compared to the gilded existence of my brother, Julian. For the past 12 years, my life has been measured in 14-hour shifts, dictated by the relentless demands of structural engineering and the unforgiving environments of active construction sites across the Pacific Northwest. While Julian was sleeping until noon in his silk sheets, I was waking up at 4:30 a.m. to the abrasive blare of a basic digital alarm clock, pulling on a pair of $40 work boots from a discount surplus store that had long since lost their cushioning. My feet have spent more time encased in those cheap steel-toed shells than in any fashionable footwear, and the calluses on my palms are a permanent record of the years I spent climbing scaffolding in the freezing Seattle rain to inspect bolt torques and weld integrity. I drove a silver 2012 Ford Focus with 212,000 miles on the odometer and a prominent spiderwebbing crack in the windshield that I refused to fix because every $100 spent on aesthetics was $100 taken away from my dream. That car rattled with the ghosts of a decade of hard labor, smelling faintly of stale coffee and damp blueprints, a stark contrast to the pristine leather-scented interior of the vehicle my brother operated with the casual carelessness of someone who has never paid a bill in his life. Julian is 24 years old and occupies the self-appointed role of a professional socialite, a term that in our family means he spends his days curated for an Instagram feed and his nights depleting the family's remaining liquidity at high-end lounges like Ascend in Bellevue or Q Nightclub in Capitol Hill. He navigates the world wearing $900 Balenciaga hoodies that look intentionally distressed, a fashion statement that mocks the actual distress of the clothes I wear for work, and he moves through the city in a 2024 gentian blue Porsche 911 Turbo S. That car is not an asset he earned, but a leased burden that costs $3,200 every single month between the predatory lease payments and the astronomical insurance premiums required for a driver with his history of speeding tickets and minor scrapings. Every time that Porsche roared to life, it was fueled by the sweat of my brow and the silent sacrifices I made to maintain the Vance family's crumbling facade of wealth. While I was calculating wind loads for 40-story residential towers and navigating the complex bureaucracy of the King County Department of Local Services, my father was quietly funneling the remnants of our heritage into Julian's hollow lifestyle, viewing my brother as a brand to be maintained while I was merely a utility to be exploited. I had been meticulously hoarding my resources with a discipline that bordered on the religious, funneling every spare cent into a high-yield savings account at Vanguard that sat at a balance of exactly $134,250.75. That specific number was not an abstraction to me, but a carefully constructed bridge to my future, the exact capital required to secure the comprehensive construction permits and initial site preparation for a 4-acre plot of land I had managed to buy in the Snoqualmie Valley. That land was my sanctuary, a quiet expanse of cedar and Douglas fir where I planned to build a custom, energy-efficient home that would serve as both my residence and the headquarters for Vance Structural Consulting. I had spent hundreds of hours in the evenings, after my grueling shifts at the firm, drafting the architectural plans, calculating the load distributions for a cantilevered deck that would overlook the river, and researching the most cost-effective ways to install a geothermal heating system. That money was supposed to be the first shovel in the ground, the physical manifestation of 12 years of denying myself luxury. But to my father, it was simply a convenient pile of cash that could be liquidated to protect Julian's ego and his precious collection of horological investments. The contrast between us was never more apparent than on the weekends when Julian would stumble into the kitchen of the estate, his eyes bloodshot from a night of bottle service, complaining about the lag on his high-speed internet or the fact that the housekeeper hadn't properly pressed his designer denim. I would be sitting at the breakfast bar in my stained high-visibility vest, drinking a lukewarm cup of generic brand coffee, reviewing a 200-page geotechnical report for a new project in the Denny Triangle. My father would walk in, ignore my presence entirely, and ask Julian if he needed a refill on his Starbucks Gold Card or if he wanted to go look at a new limited edition timepiece at the boutique in downtown Seattle. They spoke a language of acquisition and leisure that I was intentionally excluded from, a dialect of the elite that relied on the invisible labor of people like me to remain viable. My father saw my work boots and my battered Ford Focus as a source of embarrassment, a smudge on the pristine image of the Vance family, never realizing that my refusal to indulge in vanity was the only thing keeping the family name from total insolvency. He viewed my frugality not as a virtue but as a weakness, an indication that I didn't value the finer things and therefore didn't deserve to keep the wealth I had generated through sheer grinding persistence. Every penny of that $134,000 represented a choice I had made to say no to myself. It was the vacation to the Amalfi Coast I never took, the luxury apartment in South Lake Union I never rented, and the professional wardrobe I never purchased, opting instead for the same 3 pairs of rugged work trousers and a rotating collection of flannel shirts. I lived like a monk in a city of tech millionaires, driven by the singular vision of that 4-acre plot in the valley where I could finally exist without the weight of my father's expectations or Julian's parasitic needs. The high-yield account at Vanguard was the foundation of my independence, earning a modest 4.7% interest that felt like a reward for my patience. I checked that balance every Friday evening, a private ritual that gave me the strength to face another 60-hour work week in the mud and the steel. I had researched the permit fees down to the dollar, knowing that the shoreline management permit would cost me roughly $7,500 and the critical areas review would add another $4,000. I had a spreadsheet for everything, a mathematical fortress that I believed was impenetrable until my father used his position as a joint holder on the account to tear it down in a single afternoon. The sheer audacity of the liquidation was staggering because it wasn't born out of a desperate need for survival, but out of a perverse desire to maintain a lie. My father didn't need that money to keep the lights on or to pay for a life-saving surgery. He needed it to buy into a narrative that Julian was a successful collector of luxury assets, as if owning a series of expensive watches could somehow compensate for a lack of character or a total absence of professional ambition. He saw my savings as a family asset, a communal pool of resources that he had the ultimate right to redistribute according to his own warped priorities. To him, my construction permits were a little project, a hobby that could be deferred indefinitely, while Julian's status in the social circles of Seattle's elite was a pressing emergency that required the immediate infusion of 6 figures of my hard-earned capital. He treated my 12 years of 14-hour shifts as if they were a contribution to a collective fund he managed, failing to recognize that every hour I spent on a construction site was an hour I was earning my way out of his shadow. When I looked at my brother, I didn't see a golden boy. I saw a structural flaw, a person who had been allowed to expand without any internal support, a human skyscraper built on sand. Julian's Balenciaga hoodies and his leased Porsche were the architectural equivalent of gold leaf on a rotting timber frame, a beautiful surface covering a core that was destined for catastrophic failure. He walked through life with the unearned confidence of a man who believed the floor would always be there to catch him, never realizing that the floor was actually the bent back of his older sister. The $3,200 spent every month on his car could have paid the mortgage on a modest home for a family of 4. But in the Vance household, it was just the cost of doing business, a necessary expenditure to keep the illusion of wealth alive for the neighbors in Broadmoor and the followers on social media. I was the one who understood the real cost of things, the person who knew that a $12,000 watch represents thousands of hours of human life. And yet my father had the gall to tell me that my life's work was secondary to Julian's collection of toys. The high-yield savings account at Vanguard now sat at a balance of 0, a void where my future used to be. My construction permits, my 4-acre plot, and my dreams of Vance structural consulting were all suspended in the amber of my father's greed. But as an engineer, I know that when a structure is compromised beyond repair, you don't try to patch the cracks. You initiate a controlled demolition. My father thought he was securing the family's future by stealing mine, but he had actually removed the only stable element in his entire financial portfolio. He had liquidated the only person who was willing to work to save him. As I sat in my Ford Focus, staring at the cracked windshield that I still hadn't fixed, I realized that the lack of those funds was the final catalyst I needed. I didn't need a high-yield account to be an engineer, but my father certainly needed me to keep his house from falling down. He had taken my money, but in doing so, he had forfeited his right to my protection. The Vance estate was built on a foundation of my compliance, and I was officially resigning from my position as the family's structural support. If Julian's watch collection was the family's new investment, then they could rely on the ticking of those expensive gears to keep the bank from the door, because I was done holding up the sky for people who didn't even notice I was bleeding. The digital clock on my dual monitor setup at the engineering firm clicked over to exactly 2:14 p.m. on that Tuesday, a moment that will forever be etched into my memory as the exact second the structural integrity of my life gave way. I had been in the middle of reviewing a stress analysis report for a new residential development in Bellevue, but a sudden, nagging intuition prompted me to log into my Vanguard high-yield savings portal to verify the funds for the upcoming shoreline management permit. When the page loaded, the blue and white interface didn't display the familiar six-figure comfort of my hard-earned life savings. Instead, it presented a cold, hollow vacuum where the numbers $134,250.75 used to be. The current balance read exactly $0.00, a mathematical impossibility that made the blood in my veins feel like it had turned to liquid nitrogen. My breath hitched in my throat as I frantically clicked through the transaction history, finding the digital trail of a transfer initiated just hours earlier through a dormant joint access card from my sophomore year of college, an account I had opened a decade ago so my mother could deposit emergency grocery money. I realized then with a sickening clarity that my mother, Eleanor, a woman who prided herself on her refined etiquette and moral superiority, had bypassed every layer of modern security by using a forgotten relic of my past to move every single penny I owned into a destination titled Julian's Lifestyle Fund. I didn't call, and I didn't wait for the workday to end, because the sheer velocity of the betrayal required an immediate confrontation before the money could be further dissipated into the ether of my brother's vanity. I drove to the Broadmoor estate with a focused, terrifying calm, my knuckles white against the steering wheel of my battered Ford Focus as I bypassed the security gate and pulled into the circular driveway. When I burst into the kitchen, the air was thick with the cloying, suffocating scent of expensive Casablanca lilies arranged in a Waterford crystal vase, a smell that had always symbolized luxury, but now smelled like the rot of a dying dynasty. My mother was standing by the Italian marble island, delicately sipping a glass of chilled Sancerre as if she hadn't just committed a felony against her own daughter, while my father stood by the professional-grade wolf range, looking at me with a mixture of annoyance and condescension. The kitchen, with its $40,000 worth of custom cabinetry and hand-polished surfaces, felt like a stage set for a play about a family that had lost its soul, and I was the only one who realized the script had turned into a tragedy. I confronted them with the printed transaction record, my voice steady but vibrating with the force of 12 years of repressed resentment, demanding to know how they could justify stealing the very foundation of my future. My father, Harrison, didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. Instead, he adjusted the lapel of his tailored blazer and informed me with a chilling lack of empathy that I was being unfilial for not supporting my brother's vision. He spoke the word unfilial as if it were a legal verdict, suggesting that my primary purpose in life was not to build skyscrapers or secure my own house, but to serve as a silent benefactor for Julian's absurd dream of becoming a premier fashion influencer. He told me that Julian was the face of the Vance legacy and that his success in the digital space was an investment for the entire family, as if my brother's ability to curate a color-coordinated Instagram grid was somehow more valuable than the structural safety of the city of Seattle. My father's arrogance was a physical presence in the room, an invisible wall that blocked any attempt at logic or fairness, and it became clear that in his mind, my money was never truly mine. It was merely a temporary deposit in the Vance family bank, waiting to be withdrawn when the preferred heir had a whim. In the background, the scene was even more grotesque, as Julian was leaned against the sub-zero refrigerator, completely oblivious to the destruction he had caused, or perhaps reveling in it. He was busy recording a TikTok video, preening for a front-facing camera on his iPhone 15 Pro Max, his $900 Balenciaga hoodie pulled up over his bleached hair. The centerpiece of his performance was a brand-new $18,000 gold Rolex Submariner strapped to his wrist, a watch that glinted with a nauseating brilliance under the recessed LED lighting of the kitchen. That watch was not just a timepiece, it was a physical fragment of my 4-acre plot in the valley, a golden anchor that had been purchased with the money I had saved while wearing $40 work boots and working 14-hour shifts. Julian just smirked at me over the top of his phone, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph that signaled he knew exactly where the money had come from and felt he was entitled to every cent of it. He didn't see a sister who had been robbed. He saw a resource that had been successfully harvested to fund his next season of content. The injustice of the moment was so profound that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, a pressure higher than any load I had ever calculated for a steel girder. My mother finally spoke, her voice a soft, melodic weapon that cut deeper than my father's bluntness, explaining that they had only taken what was necessary to ensure Julian could maintain the appearance of success required for his new career path. She talked about brand alignment and aesthetic consistency as if they were life-saving necessities, completely ignoring the fact that she had effectively foreclosed on my ability to build my own home. They had traded my shelter for Julian's jewelry, my career for his vanity, and my trust for a Rolex that would likely be pawned within a year when the next trend emerged. The Italian marble under my feet felt cold and alien, a reminder that this house, this family, and this entire reality were built on a predatory hierarchy where I was the only one expected to sacrifice. I realized then that my father's definition of family was a one-way street where the parents and the golden son took everything, and the daughter was expected to be grateful for the privilege of being their foundation. I looked at my father, a man who had built a career on real estate but clearly understood nothing about the value of a solid base, and I saw the cracks in his own facade widening in real time. He was so blinded by his desire to see Julian succeed as a socialite that he couldn't see the legal and financial liability he had just created by authorizing a fraudulent transfer of funds. He thought his $12,000 Patek Philippe made him untouchable, but he failed to realize that an $18,000 Rolex bought with stolen funds is not an investment. It is a piece of evidence. Julian continued his recording, his voice a shallow, affected drawl as he described the weight of the gold on his wrist to his digital audience, while I stood there in my work clothes, smelling of the job site and the rain, feeling a strange sense of liberation. The theft was so absolute, so brazen, that it severed the final thread of obligation I felt toward the Vance name. They had stripped me of my savings, but in doing so, they had also stripped themselves of their power over me because you cannot control someone who has nothing left to lose. As the lilies continued to pump their sweet, sickly fragrance into the room, I made a silent vow that the $18,000 on Julian's wrist would be the most expensive mistake this family ever made. I watched him smirk again, a tiny flick of his lips that dismissed my entire existence, and I realized that he was just as much a victim of our father's delusion as I was, though he was too pampered to see the collapse coming. He was a bird of paradise in a cage of debt, and I was the one who held the key to the locks. My father told me to leave and not come back until I could be a team player, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the kitchen as if he were still a king giving orders to a subject. I didn't argue, I didn't plead, and I certainly didn't cry in front of them, because an engineer knows that when a structure is failing, the best thing you can do is get out before the roof comes down. I turned my back on the marble, the Rolex, and the lilies, walking out into the drizzly Seattle afternoon with a clarity of purpose that no amount of money could buy. The $134,000 was a debt that would be repaid, not through Julian's lifestyle fund, but through the cold, calculated application of the law and the financial reality of the Vance estate's precarious situation. My parents thought they were protecting the family legacy, but they were actually pulling the pin on a grenade that would level their $3.8 million world. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror at the massive, imposing house shrinking in the distance, and I didn't see a home anymore. I saw a condemned building. Family is supposed to be the one place where you are safe from the predatory nature of the world. But in the Vance household, the predators lived in the master bedroom and the nursery. They had liquidated my savings, but they had also liquidated the only thing that was keeping their house of cards standing: my silence. The countdown to the foreclosure of their lives had begun at 2:14 p.m., and while they were busy celebrating Julian's new watch, I was already calculating the exact amount of force it would take to bring the whole thing crashing down around them. If they wanted to see what an unfilial daughter looked like, I was more than happy to show them the full extent of my structural expertise. The digital clock on the dashboard of my 2012 Ford Focus flickered to 11:45 p.m., the green light casting a sickly hue over the interior of the cabin as the rain hammered against the roof with the rhythmic intensity of a machine gun. I was sitting in the far corner of a deserted, oil-stained parking lot in South Lake Union, the kind of place where the towering glass giants I helped design loomed over me like silent, indifferent gods. The heater in the Focus had long since given up, leaving the air inside the car cold and damp, smelling of old upholstery and the metallic tang of the heavy-duty blueprints rolled up in the back seat. I had a yellow legal pad resting against the steering wheel, the pages slightly curled from the humidity, and I was staring at the handwriting that looked more like an autopsy report than a set of notes. I had spent the last 3 hours meticulously calculating the true cost of my loyalty to the Vance name, and the numbers staring back at me were a testament to a decade of professional and personal exploitation. I counted 4,380 days of voluntary and involuntary overtime, thousands of hours spent in a hard hat and steel-toed boots while the world slept, all to accumulate exactly $134,250.75 that had been erased in a single afternoon. Underneath that figure, I wrote a 0 with a circle around it, representing the exact percentage of respect, gratitude, or basic human decency I had received from my own bloodline in return for 12 years of being their silent financial stabilizer. I didn't scream, and I didn't beat my fists against the cracked dashboard, because as a structural engineer, I know that raw emotion is just unchanneled energy that serves no purpose in a recovery operation. Instead, I felt a profound, icy clarity settle into my bones, the kind of stillness that comes right before a controlled demolition when the charges have been set and the perimeter has been cleared. I reached into the passenger seat and pulled out my ruggedized Dell Latitude laptop, the heavy-duty casing scratched from years of being tossed into the back of sight trucks, and I waited for the OS to boot up while the wipers made a lonely, dragging sound across the glass. I didn't go to a lawyer or a police station, not yet, because the theft of my savings was just the surface crack in a much deeper, more systemic failure within my father's empire. I navigated to my encrypted contacts and found the name Marcus Thorne, a high-stakes forensic auditor and financial investigator whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary in the world of Pacific Northwest real estate. Marcus and I had a history that went back 3 years to the construction of the Meridian Tower project, a 50-story residential skyscraper where his auditing firm had been facing a $5 million structural negligence lawsuit due to a series of clerical errors in the building's material certifications. I had spent 6 sleepless nights cross-referencing every steel mill certificate and weld inspection report, eventually finding the specific documentation that proved the errors were the fault of a third-party vendor, effectively saving Marcus's firm from total professional and financial ruin. He had looked me in the eye when the case was dismissed and told me that he owed me a life debt, a favor that transcended the usual professional courtesies of the industry. As the blue light of the laptop screen illuminated the interior of my cold car, I realized that tonight was the night I was going to collect on that debt with interest. I sent a single high-priority encrypted message to his private server, containing nothing but my coordinates and the words, "The foundation has failed. Initiate the inspection." Within 6 minutes, my phone vibrated with a call from a masked number, and Marcus's voice, as dry and precise as a balance sheet, filled the small space of the Ford Focus. He didn't ask if I was okay or why I was calling him at nearly midnight on a Tuesday. He simply asked for the data points. I spent the next 45 minutes dictating the details of my father's $3.8 million estate, the $450,000 bridge loan I had been coerced into co-signing, and the specific routing numbers of the Vanguard account that my mother had illicitly drained to fund Julian's $18,000 Rolex. As I spoke, I could hear the rapid-fire clicking of Marcus's mechanical keyboard on the other end of the line, a sound that felt like the gears of a massive trap beginning to turn. We weren't just discussing a way to get my $134,000 back. We were beginning to map out the total financial excommunication of Harrison and Eleanor Vance. Marcus began pulling up the public records of my father's recent land acquisitions, noting the precarious nature of the high-interest debt he had used to maintain the illusion of the Broadmoor lifestyle. We looked at the numbers together through a shared encrypted screen, and it became terrifyingly clear that my father had been running the Vance family like a Ponzi scheme, using my credit score and my savings as the collateral for loans that were essentially paying the interest on previous loans. The $18,000 spent on Julian's watch wasn't just my money. It was the last bit of liquidity the family had, the final bucket of water being poured into a sieve. Marcus pointed out that because my mother had used a dormant joint card from my college years to bypass security, she had technically committed wire fraud, and since the amount exceeded $100,000, the federal implications were significant. We didn't want to just file a police report. We wanted to trigger a cascading failure that would force the bank to call in every single loan my father had taken out over the last 5 years. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction as Marcus highlighted the specific clauses in the bridge loan I had co-signed, showing me that if I defaulted on my end or filed a formal notice of financial coercion, the entire $450,000 debt would accelerate, hitting my father's primary assets like a wrecking ball. I sat there in the rain. The cold seeped into my legs, but I felt more alive than I had in years because for the first time, I wasn't the one trying to hold the building up. I was the one identifying the exact points where the support beams were the weakest and preparing to pull the pins. Marcus's voice remained calm as he laid out the timeline, explaining how we would move my remaining professional assets into a protected trust before the first legal notice hit the Broadmoor mailbox. He told me that by the time we were finished, Julian's luxury watch collection would be the only thing the Vances had left to their name, and even those would likely be seized by the court to satisfy the inevitable mountain of creditors. The plan was a masterpiece of financial engineering, a systematic dismantling of a corrupt structure that had relied on my labor for far too long. I thought about my father's $12,000 Patek Philippe and the way he had adjusted it while telling me I was unfilial, and I realized that he had no idea that the very daughter he dismissed as a utility was now the lead investigator in his downfall. The rain continued to pour, blurring the lights of the city outside my cracked windshield, but inside the car, the legal pad was now covered in a different kind of calculation. I wasn't counting the days of overtime anymore. I was counting the hours until the first domino fell. I had been an engineer of skyscrapers, but tonight I was becoming an engineer of consequences. Marcus told me to go home, get some sleep, and prepare for a meeting at his office at 8 a.m. sharp, where we would finalize the filings that would strip my parents of their financial standing and their social status. As I ended the call, I looked at the 0 I had circled on the legal pad. That 0 was no longer a symbol of what I had been given. It was a target. I was going to leave my parents with exactly what they had left me, nothing. No house, no credit, no reputation, and no daughter to bail them out when the roof finally caved in. I started the engine of the Ford Focus, the old car vibrating under my hands, and I felt a strange sense of peace. The theft of my $134,000 was meant to be my ending, but as the lights of the parking lot faded into the rearview mirror, I knew it was actually the opening act of the Vance family's final collapse. I was going to build something new on the ruins of their arrogance, and this time, the foundation would be made of something far stronger than blood. It would be made of justice, calculated to the fourth decimal point. Exactly 72 hours after the digital void appeared in my Vanguard account, I found myself standing in the hushed, pressurized atmosphere of a mahogany row office on the 48th floor of the Columbia Center in downtown Seattle. The view through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows was a sprawling tapestry of gray mist and the skeletal cranes of the waterfront. But my focus was entirely on the woman sitting across from me, Ms. Sterling, a senior partner whose reputation for dismantling corporate fraud was as sharp and cold as a surgical blade. She did not offer me platitudes about family or soft words of comfort. Instead, she reached across her polished obsidian desk and presented a heavy, spiral-bound dossier that totaled 156 pages of financial ruin. The weight of that document in my hands felt like the physical manifestation of the truth I had suspected but never dared to quantify until now. As I leafed through the pages, the smell of high-grade bond paper and expensive ink filled the air, a stark contrast to the diesel fumes and wet concrete of the job sites where I had earned the money my family had so casually discarded. The investigation, spearheaded by Marcus and refined by Ms. Sterling's team of forensic specialists, had uncovered a rot that went far deeper than a single stolen savings account or a spoiled brother's penchant for luxury timepieces. We found that my father, Harrison Vance, had been engaged in a desperate and systematic campaign of financial inflation, artificially bloating the reported assets of Vance Development Group by $1,200,000 to maintain the covenants of his revolving bank loans with a major regional lender. He had been cooking the books with the frantic energy of a man trying to outrun an avalanche, using phantom valuations on properties in the Rainier Valley and exaggerated rental income from his struggling commercial holdings to keep the credit lines open. The $134,250.75 they had stolen from me was not just a convenience for Julian, it was the only clean, untainted cash remaining in their entire ecosystem, the last bit of legitimate liquidity that wasn't tied up in fraudulent leveraged debt or overextended margins. As the rain streaked horizontally across the glass of the skyscraper, Ms. Sterling pointed to a specific section of the dossier titled Unauthorized Transfers and Forgeries, where she had highlighted the digital fingerprints of my mother's betrayal. I stared at the high-resolution scans of the transfer authorization, noting the way Eleanor had attempted to mimic my signature on the joint access paperwork, a shaky, desperate imitation that failed every forensic check for pressure and stroke velocity. I gathered every piece of evidence like a general preparing for a final offensive, including the 12 recorded phone calls I had archived over the past 2 years, where my father had pressured me to co-sign bridge loans while explicitly promising that my personal savings would remain untouched and protected. These recordings, coupled with the detailed GPS logs of Julian's 2024 Porsche 911 Turbo S, created a devastating timeline of their greed, showing exactly how my life's work had been converted into a vulgar spending spree at the Gucci and Louis Vuitton boutiques at the Bellevue Square Mall. Julian had spent over $42,000 in a 48-hour window following the liquidation of my account, purchasing a limited edition embossed leather trunk and a series of silk shirts that cost more than my monthly mortgage. The GPS data showed his car idling in the valet zone of the luxury wing for hours, while he used my construction permit funds to buy the approval of sales associates and the envy of his digital followers. Ms. Sterling flipped to page 89, which detailed a specific transaction of $6,400 for a designer leather jacket, a purchase made at the exact same time I was sitting in my cold Ford Focus, calculating my overtime hours on a yellow legal pad. The contrast was a structural failure of morality that no amount of mahogany or high-rise prestige could mask, and as I looked at the data, I felt the last lingering fragment of daughterly hesitation dissolve into a cold engineering focus. We had the forged signatures, the fraudulent asset valuations, and the clear trail of embezzlement that connected my parents' financial crimes to Julian's illicitly funded lifestyle. Mrs. Sterling explained with a chillingly calm tone that by using a dormant joint account to facilitate a transfer based on a forged signature to hide the fact that their primary business accounts were insolvent, my parents had crossed the threshold into felony territory. The $134,000 was no longer just a family dispute. It was the smoking gun in a massive bank fraud case that would inevitably draw the attention of the state's Financial Crimes Division. I sat there in my charcoal gray slacks, my work boots tucked under the expensive chair, and realized that my father's $12,000 Patek Philippe was currently ticking away the final minutes of his freedom. He had assumed that because he was the patriarch of the Vance name, he was exempt from the laws of cause and effect, but he had forgotten that I spent my life studying those very laws. I was the one who understood that if you remove the sheer walls of a building, the gravity of its own weight will eventually do the work for you, and the Vance estate was currently standing without any lateral support. I spent the next 4 hours in that office, methodically signing affidavits and authorizing the release of my personal financial records to the auditing team, providing the necessary contrast between my legitimate earnings and my father's fabricated wealth. We had mapped out a strategy of total financial excommunication that would begin with a formal cease and desist order, followed immediately by a filing in the King County Superior Court to freeze all assets tied to the joint account and the Vance Development Group. This wasn't just about recovery, it was about a controlled demolition of the lies that had kept me in a state of indentured servitude to my own family. I watched as Ms. Sterling's paralegals scanned the GPS logs and the Louis Vuitton receipts into a secure server, the blue light of the scanner reflecting off the mahogany walls like a digital siren. Every click of the mouse and every whir of the printer was a hammer blow against the $3.8 million house in Broadmoor, a house that was now legally and financially condemned. I thought about the way Julian had smirked at me while recording his TikTok, his gold Rolex submariner catching the light of a kitchen that was technically being foreclosed upon by his own ignorance. He had no idea that the luxury goods he was flaunting were essentially stolen property, and that the sister he looked down upon was currently dismantling his entire world from the 48th floor of a building he could never afford to enter on his own merit. My father's arrogance had been his greatest weakness, leading him to believe that he could steal from the person who knew his financial blueprints better than anyone else. He had treated me like a line item on a balance sheet that he could simply delete, but he had failed to account for the fact that I was the one who wrote the ledger. As I stood up to leave, Ms. Sterling shook my hand, her grip firm and professional, and she told me that by Friday the Vance family would finally understand the true definition of an investment. I walked out of the Columbia Center and into the biting Seattle wind, the rain now a heavy downpour that washed over the pavement. I didn't feel the cold anymore because the fire of my purpose was keeping me warmer than any $900 Balenciaga hoodie ever could. I had the dossier, the recordings, the forgeries, and the GPS logs, a 156-page manual for the destruction of the Vance legacy. My father had wanted me to be unfilial, and I was going to exceed his expectations by being the most precise, calculated, and devastatingly effective adversary he had ever encountered. The 4,380 days of overtime had prepared me for this moment, giving me the endurance and the attention to detail required to see this through to the very last decimal point. The $134,250.75 was the price of my silence, and since they had decided not to pay it, they were about to find out exactly how much my voice was worth. As I drove my Ford Focus back toward my apartment, I saw the lights of the city reflecting in the puddles, and for the first time in 12 years, I didn't feel like a support beam. I felt like the architect of my own justice, and the structure I was building was going to be indestructible. The trap was set for my parents' 35th wedding anniversary gala, an event that was designed to be the ultimate coronation of the Vance legacy, but was instead destined to become its formal inquest. The venue was the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel in downtown Seattle, a space defined by its soaring Italian Renaissance ceilings and massive crystal chandeliers that cast a predatory glitter over the 185 guests in attendance. This guest list was a carefully curated database of power, including the city's top real estate investors, influential city council members, and the very bankers who held the keys to my father's over-leveraged empire. My father had spared no expense he didn't actually have, spending $45,000 on the catering alone, a vulgar display that featured mounds of chilled beluga caviar served on mother-of-pearl spoons and a continuous flow of vintage crystal champagne that cost $500 a bottle. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements, thousands of white orchids and deep crimson roses, and the suffocating musk of old money trying to hide the smell of imminent decay. I arrived at exactly 8:30 p.m., stepping out of the shadows of the foyer wearing a $3,500 custom charcoal wool suit that I had purchased with the very last of my liquid business dividends, a garment that felt less like clothing and more like a suit of titanium armor designed for a high-stakes structural intervention. I moved through the crowd with the deliberate, measured gait of an engineer walking a site that is about to be demolished, my presence a stark contrast to the fluid, drunken grace of the socialites around me. I didn't stop for a drink, and I didn't engage in the performative small talk that usually defined these Vance family functions. My eyes were fixed on the raised mahogany podium at the far end of the ballroom, where my father, Harrison, was currently holding court. He looked the part of the triumphant patriarch in his bespoke tuxedo, his $12,000 Patek Philippe glinting under the stage lights as he gestured expansively toward a group of potential development partners. I could hear his voice projecting over the soft strains of a live string quartet, his tone rich with a fabricated confidence as he bragged about his self-made empire and the visionary leadership that had allegedly built the Vance name from nothing. He was selling a lie to men who traded in millions, unaware that the daughter he had dismissed as unfilial was currently carrying the structural blueprints of his destruction in a slim, encrypted tablet tucked under her arm. My mother, Eleanor, stood beside him in a gown that cost more than a year of my car payments, her face a mask of practiced elegance that hid the fact that she had personally forged my signature to fund Julian's current outfit. Speaking of Julian, he was positioned just to the left of the podium, his $18,000 gold Rolex Submariner visible as he adjusted his camera on a stabilizer, likely preparing to live stream the evening's highlights to his hollow digital audience. He looked at me as I approached, his smirk still firmly in place, a look of smug superiority that suggested he thought I was here to beg for a seat at the table. He had no idea that I wasn't there for a seat. I was there to collapse the table entirely. The vibration in the room changed as I stepped onto the stairs of the podium, a subtle shift in frequency that occurs when a load-bearing element is introduced to a space that was previously unsupported. My father didn't stop speaking immediately, his momentum carrying him through a sentence about the projected 20% returns on his latest Rainier Valley project. But as I reached the top step and stood directly beside him, his words faltered. He looked at me with a flash of genuine irritation, his eyes flicking to the guests as if searching for a way to have me removed before I could disturb the carefully crafted atmosphere of success. He leaned in, the scent of expensive scotch and arrogance rolling off him in waves, and whispered that this was not the time for my dramatics, and that I should find my seat before I embarrassed the family further. I didn't move, and I didn't whisper back. Instead, I reached out and adjusted the microphone, the feedback hum echoing through the grand ballroom and silencing the quartet. 185 pairs of eyes, representing billions of dollars in collective net worth, turned toward the podium, and for the first time in 31 years, I was the one controlling the narrative. I looked at the city council members who had granted my father his permits, the investors who had trusted his inflated asset reports, and the brother who was wearing my house on his wrist. I felt the charcoal wool of my suit press against my shoulders, a reminder of the thousands of hours of overtime and the $40 work boots that had led me to this specific point in time and space. I looked my father directly in the eye, seeing the moment the first crack of realization appeared in his composure. He saw the cold, mathematical certainty in my expression, the look of a senior structural engineer who has found a fatal flaw in a skyscraper's foundation and knows that there is no way to patch it. The silence in the room became absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the grand space, leaving only the sound of the vintage cristal bubbles popping in glass flutes and the distant, rhythmic ticking of the Patek Philippe on his wrist. My mother's hand went to her throat, her fingers brushing the diamond necklace that was likely another casualty of their fraudulent credit lines, while Julian lowered his phone, the smirk finally beginning to slide off his face like melting wax. I opened the digital dossier on my tablet, the blue light reflecting off the mahogany of the podium, and I prepared to deliver a speech that had nothing to do with anniversaries and everything to do with the laws of physics and finance. My father had spent 35 years building a house of cards and another 12 years using me as the glue to keep it from falling. But tonight I was officially withdrawing my support. I wasn't just his daughter anymore. I was the forensic auditor of his soul, and the audit was about to become public record in front of the most powerful people in Seattle. I began to speak, my voice amplified by the Fairmont's high-end sound system, carrying with it the weight of 12 years of 14-hour shifts and the icy clarity of a rainy night in a South Lake Union parking lot. I didn't start with a greeting, and I didn't offer a toast. I started with a number, $134,250.75. I watched as the color drained from my father's face, leaving him looking older and smaller than the self-made titan he claimed to be. I described the high-yield savings account at Vanguard, the forged signatures, the wire fraud, and the $18,000 Rolex that was currently being used as a prop for a TikTok socialite. I watched the city council members lean in, their faces shifting from polite boredom to intense professional scrutiny, as they realized that the man they were celebrating was a common thief who preyed on his own blood to keep his lights on. The beluga caviar and the vintage champagne suddenly seemed like the cheap, tawdry distractions they were, the aesthetic gold leaf on a rotting timber frame. As I spoke, I could feel the structural integrity of the Vance legacy failing in real time, the weight of their 35 years of lies finally exceeding the capacity of their foundation. My father tried to reach for the microphone, his hand shaking, but Ms. Sterling's team had already ensured that the hotel's security were aware of the legal filings being served at that very moment. I stood my ground, the titanium-like suit holding me upright, as I detailed the $1,200,000 in inflated assets and the predatory bridge loans that had turned my life into a commodity. I wasn't just seeking my money back. I was performing a controlled demolition of their social and financial standing, ensuring that by the time the last guest left the grand ballroom, the name Vance would be synonymous with insolvency and betrayal. I looked at Julian, who was now staring at his gold watch as if it had become a shackle, and I felt a sense of peace that no skyscraper could ever provide. The anniversary gala was supposed to be a celebration of 35 years of marriage, but it had become the site of a long overdue collapse. Every word I uttered was a calculated charge set against a different pillar of their world, and as the reality of the situation settled over the room, I saw the investors start to turn away, their faces hardening into the masks of men who were already mentally writing off their losses. I was the architect of this moment, the one who had measured the cracks and predicted the failure, and as I finished my statement, I felt the relief of a person who has finally stepped out from under a falling building. The structure was gone, the foundation was shattered, and the debris was about to be cleared away by the cold, impartial hands of the law. I walked off the podium and through the crowd, the sea of tuxedos and gowns parting for me like I was a force of nature, leaving my parents standing in the wreckage of their own making, surrounded by the smell of expensive lilies and the taste of bitter, stolen champagne. I was no longer the reliable support beam. I was the one who had survived the collapse, and I was walking out into a world where my name belonged to me and me alone. I did not rely on the volatile instability of human emotion to deliver my message, because as a structural engineer, I have learned that the only thing more powerful than a scream is a fact presented with undeniable clarity. Instead of pleading for my father's conscience or my mother's mercy, I utilized the high-definition laser projector that had been intended to display a sentimental montage of 35 years of Vance family highlights. With a single deliberate press of a button on my encrypted tablet, the 20-foot-wide silk screen behind the podium flickered to life, bathing the grand ballroom in the sterile, unforgiving blue light of a forensic audit. I bypassed the photos of childhood vacations and holiday dinners, replacing them with a high-resolution scrolling feed of my Vanguard bank statements, the forged transfer documents with my mother's shaky imitation of my signature, and a side-by-side comparison of my father's inflated asset reports versus the cold, hard reality of his empty shell companies. The room, which only moments ago had been filled with the sophisticated hum of Seattle's elite, plunged into a silence so absolute it felt as though the atmospheric pressure had suddenly dropped, leaving the 185 guests gasping for air in the vacuum of the truth. I leaned into the microphone, my voice echoing off the Italian Renaissance ceilings with a resonance that felt like the tolling of a funeral bell for the Vance legacy, and I spoke the words that would officially condemn the structure of our family. This entire anniversary gala, from the $45,000 catering bill to the beluga caviar currently resting on your mother-of-pearl spoons, was paid for with exactly $134,250.75 of stolen wages liquidated from the personal savings of your own daughter, I told the silent room, my gaze sweeping across the faces of city council members and high-stakes investors. I watched as the information hit them with the force of a structural collapse, the realization dawning on them that they were not guests at a celebration, but unwitting accomplices in a desperate act of familial embezzlement and bank fraud. The only response to my declaration was the sharp, violent sound of a $600 bottle of vintage crystal champagne shattering against the marble floor at the back of the room, a spray of gold liquid and jagged glass that served as the opening note for the chaos that followed. The reaction was not a slow fade, but a rapid, systemic failure of social and financial trust, as the city's top investors began walking out in a synchronized retreat, their polished Oxfords clicking frantically against the floor as they reached for their iPhones to call their lawyers before they even cleared the hotel's valet station. They didn't need to hear another word. They had seen the forged signatures and the shell company audits, and in the world of high-stakes real estate, a man who would steal from his own daughter is a man who would certainly collapse a multi-million-dollar investment without a second thought. My father, Harrison, stood frozen on the podium beside me, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, his hands gripping the mahogany edge so hard that his $12,000 Patek Philippe seemed to strain against his wrist. He looked out at the disappearing backs of the men he had spent decades trying to impress, realizing in real time that the $48,000 ballroom rental had just become the most expensive grave he would ever dig for his reputation. My mother, Eleanor, who had built her entire identity on the curated elegance of the Vance name, underwent a physical transformation that was as grotesque as it was fascinating to witness from my position of power. Her face, usually polished to a high sheen by $4,000 worth of monthly skincare treatments, turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray that perfectly matched the cold light of the emerald necklace around her throat. A $15,000 piece of jewelry that now looked like a heavy green shackle around her neck. She looked toward the guests, perhaps hoping for one of her socialite friends to offer a sympathetic glance, but the women she had shared tea and charity committees with were already clutching their designer handbags and avoiding her gaze as if she were a carrier of a financial plague. The orchids and roses that had filled the air with their cloying fragrance now seemed to droop under the weight of the scandal, the scent of expensive lilies suddenly replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of the shattered champagne and the ozone of the high-powered projector. Julian, the golden child who had spent my construction permit money on an $18,000 Rolex, was the most pathetic figure in the room, standing by the hors d'oeuvres table with his phone still in his hand, though the live stream he had been so proud of was likely now a feed of his own family's public execution. I looked down at him from the podium, seeing the way he instinctively tried to hide the gold watch behind his back, a gesture that was as futile as trying to stop a skyscraper from falling by holding up your hands. He was no longer a fashion influencer or a socialite. He was a 31-year-old parasite who had just been exposed as a recipient of stolen goods, and the look of pure, unadulterated terror in his eyes was the most honest thing I had ever seen from him. He realized, perhaps for the first time in his pampered life, that the Porsche, the hoodies, and the watches were not assets, but liabilities that would be seized by the forensic auditors Marcus had already unleashed upon their accounts. The structural integrity of the Vance name had been predicated on my silence and my compliance, a foundation I had maintained through 12 years of 14-hour shifts and $40 work boots. But I had finally removed the last support beam. As the final few guests hurried toward the exit, their faces obscured by the shadows of the ballroom, I felt the immense weight of the family legacy finally sliding off my shoulders and crashing into the abyss below. I stood on that podium for a full minute after I finished speaking, watching the blue light of the projected bank statement scroll over my father's tuxedo, a digital branding of his crimes that he would never be able to wash off. He turned to me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, and tried to speak, but the words were drowned out by the sound of sirens outside the Fairmont Olympic. Not for us, but perhaps for the city itself, a reminder that the world continues to move even when a dynasty falls. I didn't need to stay for the aftermath. The demolition was complete, and the dust was already beginning to settle over the ruined caviar and the abandoned champagne flutes. I walked down the steps of the podium, my charcoal suit feeling as light as air now that the mission was accomplished, and I passed my mother without so much as a glance at her emeralds or her fading elegance. I walked through the grand ballroom, stepping over the shards of the broken crystal bottle, the glass crunching under my heels like the bones of the Vance Empire. Outside, the Seattle rain was falling in a steady, cleansing sheet, washing away the smell of the lilies and the arrogance of the gala. I walked toward my 2012 Ford Focus, which looked like a humble monument to reality amidst the sea of Maseratis and Range Rovers in the valet line, and I felt a sense of structural balance I hadn't known since I was a child. The $134,250.75 was gone, likely spent on Julian's vanity and this hollow celebration, but the value of the truth I had just unleashed was immeasurable. I had foreclosed on their lies, liquidated their reputation, and engineered a future where I was no longer the invisible pillar holding up a house of cards. As I pulled out of the Fairmont driveway, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the lights of the ballroom flickering as the hotel staff likely began to shut down the event prematurely, leaving my parents and my brother alone in the dark with their stolen watches and their emerald necklaces. They had thought they could steal my future to preserve their past, but they had failed to realize that an engineer's greatest skill isn't building things. It's knowing exactly how much pressure is required to bring a corrupt structure down. I was 31 years old, a senior structural engineer, and for the first time in my life, the ground beneath my feet was perfectly, beautifully solid. My name is Audrey Vance, and while my family's estate was currently in a state of terminal collapse, I was already drafting the plans for a new life, built on a foundation that no one would ever be able to forge or steal again. The cold, mechanical efficiency of the legal system moved with a velocity that even I, a woman who calculates the speed of structural collapse, found breathtaking. By exactly 9 a.m. the morning following the disastrous 35th anniversary gala, the primary commercial lender for the Vance Development Group, acting on the urgent forensic dossier provided by Ms. Sterling and the alarming public testimony I had delivered at the Fairmont Olympic, executed a total freeze on every single business and personal account associated with my father Harrison Vance. The $134,250.75 that had been illicitly drained from my Vanguard portal was now legally classified as stolen property, a designation that acted as a precision explosive placed at the very base of their financial standing. Because the funds used to purchase Julian's luxury lifestyle were proven to be the direct proceeds of a felony-level wire fraud and embezzlement scheme, I was able to secure an emergency court order for the immediate seizure of his assets. I stood in the drizzling Seattle gray on the curb of their Broadmoor estate as a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck winced under the weight of Julian's 2024 Gentian blue Porsche 911 Turbo S, the $3,200 a month lease being terminated with the same ruthless finality as his social status. Behind the tow truck, 2 uniformed court officers entered the marble foyer to execute the seizure of his horological collection, emerging minutes later with the custom carbon fiber watch winders and the $18,000 gold Rolex Submariner that had been the center of his hollow TikTok universe. I watched from behind my sunglasses, my charcoal suit still crisp as they cataloged the $12,000 Patek Philippe my father had been wearing while he called me unfilial, placing it into a padded evidence bag like the specimen of a failed species it was. The liquidation process was not a suggestion. It was a mathematical necessity to begin the long process of restitution, and as the assets were hauled away, the $3.8 million house itself seemed to sag, the lights in the high windows flickering as the reality of their insolvency finally bypassed the gilded facade. My parents were no longer the titans of Seattle real estate. They were defendants in a cascading series of civil and criminal investigations that stripped them of their credit, their reputation, and their pride within a single business cycle. The foreclosure was swift and devoid of the sentimentality my mother tried to weaponize in a series of desperate, unread text messages. Within 60 days, the Broadmoor estate was listed at a fire sale price to satisfy the primary mortgage holders and the mountain of creditors Marcus had identified in his audit. I watched the listing photos appear online, seeing the Italian marble kitchen where the air had once smelled of expensive lilies, now looking cold and abandoned, a monument to a dynasty that had been built on the exploited labor of its own daughter. My parents, Harrison and Eleanor, were forced to retreat from the exclusive heights of the city's elite, moving their remaining meager possessions into a cramped 900-square-foot rental apartment in a sterile suburb 40 minutes south of the city. The space was smaller than the master closet of their former home, a claustrophobic box with beige carpeting and laminate countertops that served as a daily, grinding reminder of the price of their arrogance. There were no more $45,000 catering bills, no more vintage Cristal, and certainly no more $900 Balenciaga hoodies for Julian, who was now forced to navigate the world without the titanium shield of my savings account to protect him from his own incompetence. I broke all remaining contact with the people who shared my DNA through a formal, ironclad legal notice drafted by Ms. Sterling's firm, a document that prohibited them from contacting me via phone, email, or third-party intermediaries under the threat of immediate harassment litigation. I didn't want their apologies, and I didn't want their explanations, because an engineer knows that when a material reaches its breaking point, no amount of glue can restore its original structural integrity. I moved forward with the launch of Vance Structural Consulting, using the court-ordered restitution of my funds to secure that office in Pioneer Square, but I did so under a new professional identity that emphasized my work rather than my lineage. The 4-acre plot in the Snoqualmie Valley remained mine, a silent expanse of Douglas fir and cedar where the foundation for my new home was finally being poured into the earth, deep and solid and honest. I spent my evenings walking the perimeter of that land, the $40 work boots on my feet feeling heavier and more grounded than they ever had when I was carrying the weight of my father's lies. The $134,250.75 had been recovered in numerical form, but the cost of the lesson was much higher, paid in the currency of a lost family and a shattered history. I realized as I sat in my new office, looking out at the skyscrapers I had helped build, that family is not a biological mandate that grants one person the right to cannibalize the life of another. Family is a contract of mutual support, and when my father liquidated my savings to fund my brother's vanity, he didn't just take my money, he performed a controlled demolition on the very concept of our relationship. I had to bankrupt the Vance legacy to achieve a measure of justice, a decision that felt less like revenge and more like a necessary structural repair. I had cleared the site of the rot and the corruption, and though the landscape was now empty and quiet, it was finally ready for a structure that could actually stand the test of time. I am Audrey Vance, and at 31 years old, I have learned that the most important calculations we ever make are the ones that determine our own worth in the face of those who seek to devalue us. The $3.8 million estate was a house built on sand, held up by the silent, straining muscles of a daughter they never bothered to truly see. Now that the building has fallen and the dust has settled, I find that I can finally breathe the clear, cold air of my own independence. I don't drive a Porsche, and I don't wear a $12,000 watch, but I have a foundation that is calculated to the fourth decimal point and a future that belongs entirely to me. In the end, the moral of the Vance family collapse was simple. You cannot expect a structure to hold if you are constantly stealing the steel from its beams to gild the roof. I am no longer a support beam for a failing empire. I am the architect of my own life, and the home I am building now will never, ever fall.